The queens of Oreth were crowned with gold, but judged by something far colder. The last woman forced to undergo the kingdom's virginity ritual emerged from the chamber trembling, whispering that the walls themselves were listening. Hours later, she vanished without a trace, and the only clue she left behind was a single embroidered lily, the symbol of purity the palace demanded, and the symbol that destroyed her life. Tonight, you're going to learn the truth about the tests queens were forced to endure, how they were examined, monitored, and controlled, and why those who failed were quietly erased from history. If you think you know what royalty looked like, you've never heard this story. But we unveil this dark histories. Leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reached. History remembers crowns as symbols of power, prestige, and divine approval. But the truth whispered through the locked chambers of medieval courts tells a very different story. Because long before a queen stood beside her king, long before her face appeared on coins, or her name was woven into royal tapestries, she faced a ritual so secret, so humiliating, and so terrifying that no chronicle recorded it directly. Only hints, rumors, and fragments hidden between the lines. It was not a ceremony of honor. It was not a coronation. It was a test. A test carried out not to celebrate her purity, but to control her future, her body, and even the legitimacy of the entire dynasty. Tonight we step into that forgotten world. Our story begins in the kingdom of Oreth, a land overshadowed by mountains and cold winds, ruled by a dynasty older than any cathedral carved into its stone valleys. The people believed their kings descended from a mythical ancestor whose bloodline granted both authority and protection from calamity. Because of that belief, every heir needed to be unquestionably legitimate. And the burden of that legitimacy fell squarely on the shoulders of one person, the queen. But in Oreth, becoming queen was not a moment of joy. It was the beginning of a trial. The woman at the center of this story was Queen Elenara, 20 years old, educated, poised, more intelligent than anyone expected. She had been raised in a noble house known for its scholars, not its warriors. And her arranged marriage to King Aldrin was meant to unite two political factions. The people adored her grace, her composure, her diplomatic smile. But none of them knew what she endured in the days before she wore the crown. Because Elenara had learned early that royalty demanded sacrifice, but no one warned her what sacrifice truly meant. On the night before her wedding, she was led to the Hall of Oaths, a long, windowless chamber illuminated by nothing but tall beeswax candles that flickered against stone walls. 7 high-ranking courtiers stood waiting for her, each robed in colors that symbolized their authority. The High Matron, the Royal Physician, the Chancellor of Lineage, and 4 attendants sworn to secrecy. The hall was silent enough that Elenara could hear the faint tremor of her own breath echoing back to her. A servant gently removed her cloak. Suddenly the cold air felt sharper. The High Matron began reciting the ancient doctrine, her voice heavy with ritual weight, a doctrine claiming that a queen must be proven untouched, unclaimed, and unaltered before she could be sanctified into the royal bloodline. These were words older than the kingdom itself, written in a time when fear governed women's rights more than any law. And though Elenara understood they were formalities, something about the matron's tone made her feel as though she were stepping into a place where dignity had no meaning. The great irony was that the king himself, Aldrin, had never been tested. Kings were trusted, queens were inspected. Elenara lifted her chin with practiced calm, but inside her mind raced. Her mother had told her stories, vague warnings, soft whispers, hints of a ritual all noblewomen feared, but never discussed. Her tutors glossed over it, her attendants avoided it. So when the matron signaled for her to follow, she felt like she was walking into a void carved specifically for women of her rank. The testing chamber was smaller than she expected, almost shrine-like, with thick tapestries muffling every sound from the outside world. It felt sealed, isolated, suspended in time. A single wooden chair sat in the center. Not a throne, something far more ordinary, which somehow made the situation even more humiliating. Royalty surrounded her in every aspect of her life, but not here. Here, she was not a queen. She was an object of examination. The royal physician stepped forward with a solemn expression. He was older, reserved, known for his integrity. But even that brought her no comfort. He bowed slightly as though apologizing for what was about to happen, though he had performed this ritual countless times before. The courtiers watched with impassive stares, their roles dictated not by personal conviction, but by tradition older than their own families. Elenara felt her heartbeat in her throat. Her hands trembled behind her back, unnoticed. What followed was not violent, not cruel in the physical sense, but deeply invasive. Words were exchanged in hushed tones, observations murmured and recorded, as though she were a relic under scrutiny rather than a living human being. The ritual was designed to embarrass, to intimidate, to strip away her confidence before she ever stepped onto the throne, and in that moment she understood the truth. Queens were not chosen for love, nor for leadership, nor for partnership. They were chosen as vessels, carriers of heirs, bearers of lineage, symbols of purity for a kingdom obsessed with legacy. The chamber felt colder when it was over. The attendants stepped back. The matron cleared her throat, preparing to declare the results. But before she could speak, the royal physician hesitated, just long enough for Elenara to feel a wave of terror. What if something was wrong? What if they found something they deemed imperfect? What if a single court whisper destroyed her future? Queens in neighboring kingdoms had vanished under such accusations. Some were quietly sent back to their families. Others were placed in convents where they would spend the rest of their lives in religious silence, forgotten by history. Elenara felt every possible consequence closing in around her like tightening chains. Then the physician finally spoke. She meets the requirements of the rite. Relief washed over her so suddenly that her legs nearly gave way, but the high matron added something that sent a chill down her spine. The test shall be repeated after the wedding night, as tradition commands. Repeated, observed, recorded, sanctioned by the kingdom's laws. Elenara's breath caught. She had survived the first trial only to face an even darker one. Because the second ritual was not about verifying purity, it was about verifying consummation. And in Aurith, that verification required witnesses. Her marriage had not yet begun, yet her privacy was already gone. She returned to her chambers in silence, wrapped in ceremonial robes that felt heavier than chainmail. Her ladies-in-waiting pretended not to notice her shaken hands. Outside, the palace bustled with excitement for the royal wedding. Musicians practicing, cooks preparing feasts, nobles arriving from distant towns. But Elenara felt none of it. She felt only the weight of eyes that had examined her in silence, the eyes of people who would examine her again. That night she stood by her window overlooking the ancient courtyard below. Snowflakes drifted down in soft spirals, settling onto stone arches built centuries before she was born. A symbol of purity, some might say. Yet all she could think of was how fragile the snow looked, how easily it melted under the wrong touch. Somewhere in the courtyard she saw King Aldrin himself, walking alone beneath the torches. He looked contemplative, almost troubled. She wondered if he knew what she had endured, if he cared, if he understood the role she would be forced to play. A faint knock sounded on her door. It was the matron again. "Your Majesty," she said, already using the title, "you must retire early. Tomorrow is your wedding, and your second trial." Elenara nodded, though her stomach twisted at the words. The kingdom celebrated her. The palace prepared for her coronation. Songs were being written in her honor, but none of it mattered, because before she could become queen, she had to surrender the last thing she truly owned, her privacy. And in that silent chamber, she realized the darkest truth of all. Queens were not crowned. They were inspected, measured, judged, and only then permitted to stand beside a king. That night, as she lay awake, she understood why no chronicle wrote of these rituals, why queens smiled in portraits, but rarely in their personal letters, why so many of them seemed fragile, withdrawn, ghost-like in the early years of marriage. It wasn't the crown that weakened them. It was the humiliation they endured before they ever touched it. The morning of the royal wedding dawned bright and deceptively peaceful, as though the sun itself were unaware of the storm churning beneath Elenara's composed exterior. Outside her chamber, musicians tuned their instruments, courtiers murmured in excitement, and the vast bells of Aurith Cathedral tolled across the capital, calling the entire kingdom to witness the union of their sovereigns. But within her private room, Elenara felt as though the world had narrowed to the width of a single breath. Thin, fragile, trembling. Her maids surrounded her in silence, dressing her in a gown woven with gold thread and embroidered lilies, the same flowers associated with purity in Aurith's ancient traditions. The gown was exquisite, breathtaking, flawless. Everything the kingdom believed she should be. Yet every stitch felt like a reminder of the ritual still hanging over her like an unspoken sentence. Their hands moved carefully, almost reverently, but even their gentleness could not soothe the knowledge that soon she would be watched again, studied again, judged again. No one spoke of the test. They didn't have to. It lingered in the air like an invisible decree. When the procession began, trumpets echoed through the palace, and the gates opened to reveal thousands of citizens lining the streets, their cheers a roaring tide. Elenara walked slowly beside her father, her steps measured, her smile controlled, her eyes fixed forward. To the crowd she appeared radiant, the picture of hope and stability. If they noticed the slight stiffness in her posture or the faint tightness in her smile, they attributed it to wedding day nerves. They did not know the truth. They did not know that the queen-to-be was walking not toward a crown, but toward inspection. Inside the cathedral, King Aldrin waited for her. His expression was solemn, respectful, perhaps even kind in a distant way. He offered his arm as she approached, and when their eyes met, she saw something unexpected flicker there. Awareness. Not of the test, she wasn't sure, but of her fear. His gaze softened, if only for a heartbeat, and she felt the faintest tremor of reassurance. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The vaulted ceiling shimmered with candlelight, choirs filled the air with harmonies that echoed like ancient prayers, and the vows were spoken with precision. When Aldrin crowned her, placing the gilded circlet upon her head, the cathedral erupted in applause. The moment should have been triumphant, glorious, unforgettable. Instead, Elenara felt a cold knot settle deeper into her stomach as she recalled the matron's words. The test shall be repeated after the wedding night. Every smile she offered, every nod, every ceremonial gesture felt distant, as though she were watching herself from afar. Even as the celebration swirled around her, she felt chained to the looming ritual that would define her worth more than her intelligence, her character, or her strength ever could. As dusk settled and the palace feast began, Elenara observed the nobles who toasted to her happiness. Some looked at her with admiration, some with envy, some with thinly veiled skepticism, as if weighing her value through a lens older than themselves. It was tradition that shaped them, not malice, yet the effect was equally suffocating. King Aldrin barely left her side throughout the feast. He spoke softly to her when the crowds became too overwhelming, guiding her through the ritual dances, offering reassuring glances that hinted at a gentleness she had not expected from a ruler raised by hardened statesmen. And yet, as the night stretched on, she sensed a subtle shift in him. Not desire, but reluctance. The king did not want the second test either. She saw it in the way he tensed when the high matron approached during the feast, in the way his jaw clenched when she whispered something into his ear. His expression darkened, not with anger at Elenara, but at the weight of a tradition he had no power to break. Later, when they withdrew to the royal bedchamber, Aldrin closed the heavy door behind them and stood for a long moment without speaking. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the music of the feast drifted faintly through the stone walls. Elenara sat at the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for him to speak. When he finally did, his voice was low. "They will return at dawn," he said. "The matron, the physician, the witnesses." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I am sorry, Elenara. This tradition is older than the crown itself. I did not create it." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The silence grew heavy, weighted with a shared dread neither knew how to express. Aldrin approached her slowly, sitting beside her with an air of unexpected gentleness. He did not touch her. He did not pressure her. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, as if acknowledging the impossible position they both occupied. "I will not harm you," he said quietly. "Tonight does not need to be what they expect." Her breath loosened, just slightly. "Their ritual," he continued, "is not for us. It is for them. For the council. For the old laws that measure a queen's worth through the narrowest lens." Elenara lifted her gaze to him, surprised by the sincerity in his expression. Though she did not know him well, she sensed the weight this night placed upon him, too. He was king, but even kings could be trapped by tradition. Outside, the music faded. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, a reminder that dawn would come far too quickly. They spoke for a long time, not as king and queen, not as political figures, but as two young people bound together by a system designed long before their births. They discussed the rituals, the expectations, the scrutiny she faced. Aldrin listened carefully, his expression darkening with every detail she shared. When sleep finally claimed them, it was not in fear or forced intimacy. They simply rested beside each other, two silent figures preparing to face a dawn neither wanted. And dawn came. The knock on the door was soft but chilling. Elenara's breath caught instantly. Aldrin rose from the bed with a grim expression, opening the door just enough to let the High Matron enter. Behind her came the royal physician and two silent attendants. Their faces were devoid of emotion, carrying none of the empathy that had warmed Aldrin's words the night before. The matron bowed, stiffly, ritualistically. "The kingdom requires confirmation," she said, "as the law dictates." Elenara felt herself draw inward again, shrinking into silence, her earlier resilience beginning to crack beneath the weight of the moment. She had hoped, irrationally, that perhaps something would change, that someone would intervene, that mercy might override tradition. But the matron's tone made it clear this was not a request. This was a mandate older than the throne itself. Aldrin stood at her side, jaw clenched, eyes dark with quiet fury. But he said nothing. He could say nothing. The ritual began. No violence, no explicit act, just examination, observation. Cold, clinical procedures disguised as tradition. It lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. The matron murmured her conclusions to the physician. He recorded them. The attendants stood in silent stillness, their presence more suffocating than the cold air of the chamber. When it was over, the matron folded her hands, gave a curt nod, and prepared to deliver the verdict that would determine Elenara's fate. A single phrase. A phrase that could solidify her position as queen, or strip her of it forever. The matron's eyes flickered over Elenara, not unkindly, but without warmth. "It is confirmed," she said. "The union is legitimate." Relief washed over Elenara so sharply she nearly swayed. Aldrin steadied her with a gentle hand, his expression softening with something almost protective. But even as the attendants departed and the matron closed the heavy door behind her, Elenara understood something she had never understood before. This would not be the last test. Not for her. Not for any queen. In Aurith, a queen's body was not her own. It belonged to tradition, to the council, to the kingdom's fear of illegitimacy. She had passed the trial, for now, but the palace walls held many more rituals, many more humiliations disguised as duty, many more secrets hidden behind the crown's glittering surface. And as she leaned against Aldrin, exhausted, trembling, she realized the deepest horror of all. Queens were not protected by power. They were controlled by it.